A number of years ago, I found myself standing right there, right in front of the Holy Sepulchre, that very place where Jesus had been buried and 3 days later rose again. If you've ever been to the Holy Land or seen pictures of it, you know how it's entombed, that we've got this special tomb that's there, and that you can actually stand in line and you can wait until you enter in and you're able to pray at the spot where Jesus was laid for just a few seconds. And so I was standing in line and I didn't quite know what to expect, but I knew that this was a holy place and a beautiful place to pray. And so eventually my turn came, and then I was able to pray for just a few moments, and then it was my turn to come back out of the tomb yet again. But what I didn't realize as I was praying with that tomb that day was there was a fundamental choice that was offered as I walked out. Now, it wasn't as if I could go to the left or right. Certainly that choice was there. But this choice was whether or not to tell others about the resurrection. Whether or not to tell others that that tomb is still there, that the stone that Jesus was laid upon as his body rests for those 3 days is still there, and you can go and pray with it, and it will change your life. Because the reality is that we are all in some way in the tomb at this very moment. That the tomb has been opened, we've gone in, we found that Jesus is not there. But do we realize the choice that is ours? That we return out of the tomb and that we have to make a choice from that very moment. The Acts of the Apostles this morning, it starts to tell us a story about how Jesus is going, how he's telling others about Jesus Christ, how he suffered, died, and risen again. And at this very moment, he's actually using very convicting and powerful words, because he's starting to tell them about the ways that they put Jesus to death ultimately. How they went, how they sought after Pilate to put him to death, and how eventually that did occur. That they asked for a murderer to be released into their midst, and instead they put to death the Lord of glory. But in all of this, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of all their fathers still elected to bring Jesus to glory, and so he has risen from the dead. And Peter says, of this we are witnesses. And so we might get the impression that they are worried at this very moment about the way that they have made a mistake, how they have put the Lord of glory to death. But Peter is very quick to reassure them, you didn't know what you were doing, you were acting out of ignorance, but now we tell you the truth so that you may choose to repent and believe in the gospel. So this is a very beautiful moment, because he tells them that they didn't quite know what was going on, and indeed they did put him to death, but he still wants them to rise nonetheless, because they did not know what they were doing. And that beautiful responsorial psalm speaks very well into their circumstance. Lord, let your face shine on us. It has shone in the resurrection. It can shine upon each of those that choose to live in the glory of the resurrection as well. We move on to the first letter of St. John, and this tells us a powerful story as well. That as John is speaking, he's trying to give them the purpose for which he is written. He's telling them, I am writing you so that you may not fall into sin. But if you sin, see, John is a realist, and he recognizes that sin is very difficult to avoid. And so he's telling, we shouldn't sin. We should still strive to live a sinless life. But if you do, we have an advocate with the Father. And so to live in hope. But it's not as if he wants to paint a picture whereas we can just presume upon God's mercy, where one can just say, oh, I can just sin and be indifferent to the reality of Jesus Christ because he'll take care of it in the end. But what he's saying is that there is the advocate, but also there's more. Because if we truly choose to believe in Jesus Christ and his resurrection, then we need to believe in his commandments and in all of his teachings as well. Because he says, the one who says that I believe but does not choose to follow the commandments is a liar. No truth can be found in him. But if we choose to live by God's commandments, then is the love of God perfected in him. So as John is speaking, he wants one to realize that there is a struggle to sin, but through Jesus and through continued perseverance, one can truly prevail over that battle away from sin and death, and can move to life and life eternal. Then we finally move on to the Gospel according to Luke, and this is a moment just after the two disciples have encountered Jesus on the road to Emmaus, that he was revealed to them in the breaking of bread, and so then they return back to the disciples and they tell the good news. And as they're speaking, as they're relating their story, who else should appear but Jesus Christ himself? That he appears and he says those beautiful words, peace be with you. He recognizes there's chaos, there's confusion, there's disbelief, there's all sorts of things that are going on. And so the disciples are struggling at this very moment. But he asks them a question. Why are you troubled, and why do questions arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet, and be not unbelieving, but believe. And so he shows them his hands and his side. And while they're still incredulous for joy, he still asks for something more, another sign that he is truly there, that fish that is given to him to eat, so that he can truly prove that he is not a ghost, but he has bones, he has flesh, as no ghost might have. That in fact he is there in the flesh. He has truly risen, and risen indeed. But then he starts to go on and to tell them that he is there and he has fulfilled all the prophecies, all of the teaching, all of the canticles and psalms, all of the ones that have ever told about the Messiah, that he has fulfilled every one of those things, and that he is there and he's going to send the disciples forward to preach to all nations, beginning with Jerusalem. And he tells them this final and potent line: you are witnesses to these things. Isn't that tremendous and beautiful? That they were able to witness the resurrection. They were able to see Jesus undergo all of the mysteries of the sacred Triduum, how he went, he gave them the Eucharist, he suffered, he died, and he rose again. He tells all the disciples, you are witnesses to these things. And perhaps our hearts are filled with longing to see the Lord, to have lived in that time, to have been able to see the joy of the disciples who have just beheld their risen Lord, and indeed to see his hands and his side, and to believe, to truly be a witness, to have lived 2,000 years ago. But it's not just about those that have lived 2,000 years ago, but it's about us today. Because the reality is, my brothers and sisters, we are given this sacred time of the Easter season to recognize that we have been witnesses as well, that we have been called through these sacred liturgies to go to behold the open tomb and to see that Jesus is no longer there, but to understand through the fulfillment of the prophecies in the Scriptures that he has risen, as he said. That we also are witnesses to these things, and that is why we're still going through the Easter mysteries. But the question still remains, that even though we may not be at the Holy Sepulchre at this moment, at least physically, we should be there spiritually. That we've seen all these things, we've beheld, we've prayed with the open tomb. But has that changed our life? Because the reality is, whenever we behold that tomb, the way that the Lord has risen, there are three options that we have for the way that we can respond. One not so good, one in the middle, and one that is much better than the other two. First, the one that is not so good, that one can behold the open tomb, they can see that Jesus has risen, and then they can choose to live a life that is much more sinister, much more evil, because they realize that Jesus is risen. They know the good news, and they hear about the way that he suffered and died and rose again, and they hear the news that he is there to take away their sin. But then they presume upon his mercy, that they assume that they can just live a life that is as free as a bird, doing whatever they want, because they think in their minds, Jesus will take care of it all in the end. And while there's a certain element of that is true, there's a distortion here. Because if Jesus has died and he's risen again, that doesn't mean that we should live as if we can do whatever we want, but rather it means that we need to live in a certain way. And so it's actually a commissioning to live in a different way of life. So that's clearly not an option, but it is one that is available to us, to be worse people, and to even cause scandal within the church or even outside of the church, because people behold us, they know that we're Catholic, they know that we're Christian, they know that we believe in God, and they know that it should cause us to live differently. But if it causes us to live a worse life, how much scandal would there be if it truly caused us to live in that way? So maybe that's not the best way. But then there's the next way, which is to live indifferent to the reality of the resurrection. That certainly we show up, we do some of the things, we go through some of the motions, but the reality is our life is not fundamentally changed. That we just simply go about our daily business and do faith when it's convenient for us. But then we see that as the commissioning is happening, we have to look back at John and that first letter that he wrote. That he's not saying that you should just simply do whatever you want. He says, I'm writing you that you may avoid sin, that you may live differently, that you may recognize the way that God is calling you to live in communion with the Ten Commandments and to synchronize with those expectations that Jesus has laid out for us. He's not telling us that you can just go do whatever you want now, but he's telling you, but we have further choices to make. We have to live in synchronization with the gospel values, with the virtues, with the commandments, with all of the things that have been given to us. He doesn't say just live indifferent to the gospel. He doesn't say Jesus has died so you can live as if it doesn't matter. But he leaves us one final option. And that's to live a better life because of the gospel. To live a life of conversion, of repentance, of recognition that many times we are weak, we are fallen people, that we have pitfalls, we have our own weaknesses, that we've got a lot of things that we often fall into, but nonetheless, through all of those things, that we still want to seek after the Lord our God. That we're not going to be held back, that we're not going to find ourselves in a place where we can't return to the Lord. But nonetheless, we see the way that the tomb has been opened, the way that it's empty, and we start to tell ourselves, now the work begins. That we're going to rise as well. That we want to live in communion. We want to live in relationship with our God. That we want to follow the commandments so as to love God. We want to live to avoid sin, to read scriptures, to pray often, to do all the things that we ought to do because we've seen the open tomb. Because the reality of what we're given today is that we are witnesses, my brothers and sisters, that we have seen the open grave. We've seen the way that the tomb is now open, that Jesus Christ is not there. He has been raised, as he said. We are witnesses even 2,000 years later. And how desperately needed are we in our witness? Because we live in a world that largely is seeking something, that it's often running around, it's very chaotic, it does not know where to turn, but we do. That there is nothing that the light of Christ cannot obliterate, through whether the darkness of sin or the darkness of error and vice. There is nothing that the light of Christ cannot make positive, or nothing that it cannot provide hope for. And that is what the world needs in this day and age. But it lies up to us to be witnesses to these things, because we truly have been at the grave. We've seen the way the stone was rolled away. We've seen the ways that the linens were laying there. And we've finally seen the Lord our God, especially in the Eucharist, as he comes to us time and time again. He has truly been raised, as he said. And that reminds us that we have a choice to make. As we walk away from the tomb, as we've seen that it's opened, as we've seen the way that the Lord our God has come, suffered, died, and risen again, my brothers and sisters, we can see that we can live in a worse way. We could be indifferent to the power of the resurrection, or we could choose to change our entire life by the resurrection and by the way that the Lord has called us to manifest and to give witness to his resurrection. The tomb has been opened. We've seen all of these things. Now the question is, how is that going to change all of our lives?